So hello, my name's Louise Holt. I'm from Loughborough University in the UK. And I did have an urge to sing this morning instead of presenting what I'm going to present. And maybe that would have been more lively and appropriate. But anyway, instead I'm going to talk to you about, my slides are in Portuguese, but my presentation is in English. So I'm thinking about the power of young people's friendships in schools and the idea of the geographies of immersion. So there's my email, if anybody wants to contact me. So I just want to very quickly reiterate, say thank you to Gabriela for inviting me and for organising the conference. It's an absolute joy to see the 6th international conference being here in Brazil. They started off, the humble beginnings that they started off with actually have been a little bit underplayed. It was really just me as an early career scholar inviting some people to Reading to see where it goes. And I got some funding from the Geographies of Children, Youth and Families research group, but I am talking about a £500 underwriting of any debt that we had, and very little more. And my university, Loughborough, supported me in inviting some really big names in the field of children's geographies, including Stuart Aitken. So it really was an experiment in putting shoestrings together and seeing how it goes. And so to see it here now in Brazil, it really is wonderful. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue with all of you and all the papers that we're going to see. So today I want to talk about the power of young people's friendships in schools and the geographies of immersion. And this paper really is reflecting on quite a few projects that I've worked on throughout my time as a children's geographer. So I'm going to start with an introduction and then thinking about young people's social relationships. Considering how children's own social relationships are seen as very powerful, actually, in various arenas, the policy, media, and society, but they're also neglected. And that sets up a strange contradiction, which I will talk through a little bit more in a moment. Then I want to think about the power that young people's peer group relationships have, and think through some concepts that I've used to help me thinking about the power of young people's relationships. Emotional capital, ideas of recognition, reciprocity, which is a word I can't say very well, but since not everyone in the audience is English speaking, I might have got away with that, and the connections to cultural capital. Then thinking about my reflections I'm sharing today are based on my own empirical research, so just outlining the research that I've done. And then from the research with the young people, considering some issues of social relationships and power, how young people reproduce hierarchical identities in their own play and their own social relationships around disability. And is that the right word in Portuguese?
Deficiência, ali onde está incapacidade. Acho que seria uma tradução mais apropriada.
So to me, that's what Google Scholar gave me. I thought it sounded a bit uncomfortable, so it's
deficiência.
Deficiência. And also issues about poverty and class. So Gabriela, correct me if I'm... And also race and ethnicity. Reflecting a bit on how these differences intersect, and also relationships between different types of capital, so social capital and cultural capital. Before moving on to the discussion and reflecting on geographies of immersion and moving on to a conclusion. So in this paper, I want to critically deploy the futurity of children and young people, which I think helps to emphasize the importance of children's and young people's geographies. It's really wonderful to see how children's geographies is increasing in scope and field, and how the idea of children's geographies is actually bringing together scholars from disparate and different disciplines and backgrounds in education, sociology, and so on, together in terms of scholarship. But sometimes, particularly within geography scholarship, we can feel a little bit marginalised, and I know some of us have talked about that. And yet, which is slightly ironic, because on the other hand, children are very often seen as exceptionally important in the future of society. So I think that thinking about the futurity of children and how they are seen to be the future is a really useful strategic exercise in ensuring that both our subdiscipline, but also the important research that we do as part of that subdiscipline, can take the centre ground. So educate, and I'm focusing on education. Much of my research is focused on school spaces. So, and education is seen as pivotal to social change. So, for instance, as embodied in the Millennium Development Goals. But despite many attempts to try to promote social mobility, social inclusion, and a reduction of poverty and other kinds of differences through education, inequalities still persist. And this is a real issue in many countries across the world. It's an issue within the UK, where actually educational inequalities seem to be growing rather than decreasing. I understand, although my knowledge of the Brazilian context is limited, and I'm sure colleagues from Brazil will tell me, whether I've got this right or wrong, but I understand that it's still an issue in Brazil, despite years and years of attempts to promote social inclusion and transformation. Well, the UK and the USA do have the honour of being two of the most unequal countries in terms of education in the world, so we can consider that a dubious honour and a connection. But in many countries across the world, with both more progressive and also less progressive education systems. And these inequalities in education persist around axes of power or axes of difference with which we are quite familiar. So poverty, class, does that work as a term in Portuguese? Yeah. Race, ethnicity, disability, and so on. In Brazil, Cavalles argues that despite concerted attempts to address educational and broader social inequalities, and the fact that they have reduced inequalities in education, while younger cohorts enjoy more egalitarian educational opportunities relative to older cohorts, important... Higher? Louder? Okay. Somebody should have just said. Okay, can you hear me better now? Oh, why didn't somebody just say? Okay. Did they miss everything? No. Okay, hopefully I'll be clearer from now on. Okay, so in Brazil, while younger cohorts enjoy more egalitarian educational opportunities relative to older cohorts, there are important bottlenecks that link to persistent inequalities based on both social origin and race, which remain, particularly for the completion of secondary schooling. And many factors are explored for educational inequalities and how they endure, including family factors, macro-political and policy component, and school organisations, and so on. But there's relatively limited attention is paid to the role of young people's own sociality in most contexts on educational inequality. So the research, what I'm talking about today is based on my own research, which has been done in the UK. And although it comes from a very particular perspective, I hope that it has ideas and concepts that have a wider resonance. And it reflects on 3 projects across the course of 20 years now, actually, including young people aged between 7 and 16. In total, it involved 175 young people and 90 adults, teachers, parents, and educational policymakers. And I'm really interested in how young people as agents in space and place reproduce or can challenge and transform through their own social practices, performances, reflections, and representations, differences tied to embodied subjectivities, which tie to enduring differences in society, disability, poverty, and social class and ethnicity and race. And it ties to an idea of children as embodied social beings and becomings, devised by Holt, Holloway, and Mills 2019, which is a paper that we recently published in Progress in Human Geography. And in the UK context, there's been lots of interest, well actually UK-US Anglophone context, there's been quite a lot of interest in geographies of encounter, thinking about how the shared geographies of immersion, how when we co-locate people, there is the potential to overcome difference. And in this paper, I want to move towards geographies of immersion, which think more about time as well as space, and how children can forge shared histories, which provide the potential to transform enduring differences. So to move on, thinking about young people's social relationships and how they're both seen as powerful and yet neglected in policy, media and society. Louise Casey's review of opportunity and integration in the UK argues that if our children grow up playing and learning with people from different backgrounds, they will be less prejudiced, more understanding of difference, more confident and more resilient living in a globalised and connected society. This kind of idea, which I've drawn from a very specific context, is extremely pervasive in politics and in the media. And we will probably hear more about such ideas. We see the children of the future, we see the children as the future, and we see the children as embodying the possibility of transforming society. So I'd suggest that this, at the same time, accords and denies the agencies or potentialities, or what was the word, Stuart, that you said? The protagonists of young people. But children and young people, so it's giving them an awful lot of responsibility and power, but paying very little detailed attention to their own social relationships, actually. But geographers of children, youth and families have emphasised, and I've got some Brazilian examples here, which I hope you appreciate, that children don't just accept all other young people. Children can reproduce differences through their agencies, their potentialities, and their social practices. And these are socially and spatially constituted and situated. And children, through their own social practices, can reproduce axes of power, these enduring inequalities in society around race, class, disability, ethnicity, gender, and so on. But, importantly, co-location can provide a context for recognition and empathy. I think the comments made by the Casey review probably resonate as true to many of us. If children don't get to meet each other, if they don't get to know each other, how can they change their negative and stereotypical ideas around the difference of each other? So there are two kind of key concepts that I've come up with or worked with to think about how children are constituted in power and how powerful their social relationships are. And I'm going to kind of scoot over this because there's more detail in the paper if people want to read that. But what it really is trying to think about is how young people's social relationships are forged through a need for emotional recognition, that we all live in a world in which we need to feel recognised as part of society, that's as fundamental to our existence as any other kind of basic need, and that it's within these contexts of the need for recognition that these power relations are forged, often at kind of habitual levels. So, you know, if I choose to be a mother and to nurture my child, I am reproducing my femininity, but I'm not doing that consciously or deliberately. I'm doing that as part of my subconscious motivations. Okay, so again, the study, I'm not going to dwell on too much because I've just been told I'm a bit limited for time, but it was basically qualitative research which foregrounded the voices and experiences of young people, also involved research with adults, and in-depth observation, variously creative methods, and also variously participatory, but it wasn't fully participatory research. Okay, so what I want to move on to now is just thinking, for the time that I have left, about this. Okay, so thinking about the different relationships that children reproduce through their own social practices. So first of all, I'm going to look at disability. And quite a lot of my research has focused on how young people forge bodily and learning and emotional differences between each other, tied to the broader ways that schools reproduce those differences as well. And I draw upon the idea of disability that young people are, and special educational needs, which is when young people are deemed to require extra special support in school spaces, to be, rather than a fixed condition of the body and mind, the ways that socio-spatially shifting norms of bodily, mental, learning and socio-emotional performance intersect with corporeal experiences of difference to situate people as able and or disabled, that society in space decides what is normal and what is abnormal, and that intersects with corporeal differences, because people do have different experiences of different and troubling bodies and mental states, but to produce this idea of a dualism between the person who is disabled and the person who is enabled, and that's an incredibly powerful act. Thank you. So I just want to think about Okay, so I just want to think about how some of the children use their relationships to, not deliberately, but subconsciously, exclude, marginalize, and other each other. So here I have some examples of some children with disabilities in schools and how they had problematic and troubling friendships. Okay, but here is a more positive representation of how Ali is wheeling around in circles. So he's a little boy who uses a wheelchair. He's wheeling around in circles with four girls holding onto the back of his wheelchair. All of the children involved are laughing and seem to be enjoying themselves. A girl involved highlights the meaning of this game. We play this horsey game that Ali made up. It's well funny. You have to hold onto the back of his wheelchair and you go giddy up. We're pretending to be the horses and Ali is the carriage. So in as well as young people, children through their own behaviours can exclude and marginalise each other, often in ways that tie to the broader ways that schools exclude and marginalise each other. If they have connections, there's always the chance to overcome and challenge differences. So co-location doesn't always lead to recognition and overcoming negative ideas of difference, but it can. And what I want to highlight here is that time as well as space is important here. So much geographical accounts have emphasised the importance of space and the importance of locating people together. But what I want to emphasise is the importance of a shared history and repeated connections that helps young people to make connections across differences and friendships based on shared empathy. And also some shared interests and connections. So young people can make friends if they have shared interests, shared activities that they like to do, but also making friends is often about empathy. It's just about seeing somebody that you like, that you get on with, and it's nothing necessarily to do with you are the same as me or you are different to me. I want to just move on to so I have some more examples which tie to poverty, which I think might seem quite interesting coming from the UK context, and some issues about race and ethnicity as well. But I'm going to scoot over them in the interest of time. And there are just three things that I really want to emphasize from the paper. So there's the issue of so to move on to thinking about how the capitals intersect in school spaces. So there's a close connection between social and cultural capital. And in my research, across all of the places that we did the research, children that had more friendships tended to have a more positive view of school and actually to engage better in school. But it worked on the other way as well. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Gabriela. So these two things interconnect. And the point that I would like to raise about this is that when educators and teachers and parents even don't probably pay enough attention to children's own social relationships in things like where children sit, We take all kinds of things into consideration, such as trying to negotiate the different abilities of our classes, sometimes separating children whose social relationships can be problematic, say disruptive. But very often we don't think enough about particularly those children who might be vulnerable to being marginalised, excluded and isolated, and making sure that in our practices as educators that we really consider their social relationships. And yet my research has emphasised that that's foundational to their experiences of school, as important as the inspiring teacher, who we know is all incredibly important too. So the idea of geographies of immersion draws upon the ideas of social immersion and emphasise the importance of enduring and repeated encounters to produce shared histories and stories that do enable children to overcome differences around class, race, ethnicity, disability, and other aspects of identity. And the example that I choose is Ali and his friends, but there are many others. But this is not something that children do in isolation. It's really influenced by the social context of the school. And in my study, I had two key types of segregated schools. On the one hand, there were segregated special schools where children who have disabilities or special educational needs are separated out from the mainstream so that they can learn in a way that is seen to be catered for them. But there's an unintended consequence that they are also segregated spaces of high levels of poverty. So those two things are connecting in those spaces. And the other kind of segregated spaces within my study were my study, and I should also mention some colleagues that I've worked with, actually, Jennifer Lee and Sophie Bowlby on this work, were also segregated schools of young people with high ability, but that also coincided with relative wealth. And these were state schools, so these weren't schools that you pay for. These are schools that are free to access, but the children from more affluent backgrounds have the economic, the cultural capital, the support from the parents, the private tutors, the knowing how to get in to pass the test, to the extent that they are also spaces of very high wealth as well as education. So although actually in the wider paper and in the broader research, it's not as simple as segregation versus integration, because there are all kinds of micro-exclusions, micro-marginalizations, and children's own social relationships are very subtle. It's very worrying to me that in the current context, segregation is increasing. Actually, both of these forms of segregation in the UK context and in many other countries across the globalizing world. So I'm sure you'll tell me what it's like in Brazil. That's not something I know currently. So to conclude, the importance of the futurity of children and young people in political discourses. Children are seen as our future, and we also see this in educational policy to change society, which seems to give children an unfair responsibility in some ways to overcome all the mistakes of the current generation without always giving them the resources to enable them to do so. And this simultaneously depends on and denies children's agencies. Children are meant to change the world, and yet children's agencies are relegated. Children's agencies to include, exclude, leave out, to play with some children and pick on others, basically. Young people's social relationships are very powerful, and they have the power to reproduce, and very often do reproduce, these enduring differences, as we all do in our own social practices. But they do also have the scope to challenge and to change. Geographies of immersion can provide the context for children and young people to develop a shared history and connections, which can challenge enduring axes of power relations. And it seems to me that without these geographies of immersion and connection, it's very difficult to see how they can be overcome. This can change future society. Space is important here, but time is important as well. If these connections need to be enduring and continuous and not just fleeting and fragmentary. It's uncertain, fragile, and precarious, and it's connected to, rather than distinct from broader social processes, a variety of interconnected scales. If we continuously see negative discourses of poverty or of disability in the media and broader society, I think it's too much to expect children alone to transform that. And again, and just to mention that it's worrying to me that there's a tendency towards increasing segregation, which I'm seeing in the UK and also elsewhere across the globalising world.